Okay, in this video we're going to introduce the JavaScript programming language. JavaScript was originally created by Brendan Eich in 1995, who was working for Netscape at the time. So around that time, previous to the invention of JavaScript, web pages were static. So the web browser would retrieve some HTML from a web server and display it nicely, but you couldn't really interact with it. There were no dynamic pages. So Netscape and many of the developers at the time wanted to change that. They wanted dynamic pages. So in order to do that, they wanted to add, initially they wanted to add the Java programming language into the browser. They also wanted to try to embed the Scheme scripting language into the browser. And as they started to embark on that, they realized that it would probably be easier to just invent their own programming language. So that's what Brendan Eich did, and he actually developed the initial JavaScript language in 10 days. Now obviously quite a bit has been added since then, but it's pretty impressive what he did accomplish in 10 days, and he embedded it into Netscape, and that allowed for the dynamic pages that we see today. Okay, so what JavaScript is now, and even originally, the name JavaScript is a little bit confusing. It was originally called Mocha because they wanted to mimic the syntax of the Java programming language, right? But they wanted the functionality of Scheme. So JavaScript was eventually settled on about 3 months after it was initially developed. And that's been confusing because a lot of people confuse the Java programming language with JavaScript, and they're really quite different. So JavaScript is supported in every major browser, and each browser has an engine, a JavaScript engine, that parses and runs in JavaScript in a particular web page. Okay, so these Java engines initially all sort of supported JavaScript, but then they would design their own features, and some features would be supported in certain browsers and not in others, and so it became a really big mess supporting all the different browsers, because each browser sort of implemented their own version of JavaScript, and it was very difficult to write one page that worked in all the browsers. So this was quite the headache for, I don't know, the first maybe 10 years of development in JavaScript. So eventually, a standards organization was developed to lead the standard for JavaScript. So this is the ECMA International. They're in charge of ECMAScript. Now, ECMAScript is basically just the JavaScript standard. So it decides what features go into the ECMAScript standard, and then the designers that build the JavaScript engine implement those features. Now, the ECMAScript International allows any manufacturer to have input into what the standard should be, and additionally, manufacturers of the JavaScript engines do not necessarily have to follow the standard, but we found, based on those first 10 years or so of JavaScript, when all the browsers did not follow a standard, it was very, very difficult to code anything, because you had to have separate methods for doing everything for every single browser. It became very, very difficult. So the standards body has become very important, and nowadays most engine developers stick very closely to the ECMAScript standard, and they also obviously add their input about what should be added to the language. So if you hear the term ECMAScript, that is sort of synonymous with JavaScript, but it's basically the standard for JavaScript. Okay. So when we talk about JavaScript engines, again, this is the thing that reads JavaScript code and runs it. All right. So there's a couple different engines. There's a JavaScript engine in every browser, but there's also an engine that can run on your system in the terminal, just like a Python engine, right? So the most popular engine by far is NodeJS. So if you haven't installed NodeJS, you want to make sure you go ahead and install that. But this is based on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. So the V8 engine is the JavaScript engine used in Chromium and Chrome and several other browsers as well. So here you can see, you just go to nodejs.org, download the long-term support version. That's what LTS means. So this version will be supported for a long time. The current version is, as they add features, they add it to the current version, but sometimes the current version is not quite as stable. So LTS is supposed to be stable and stable for a long time, right? Long-term support. So usually you want to go with LTS and you should be good. So you can download that and install it, and once you've done that, I'm running Ubuntu Linux, but this works. This is multi-platform. It works on Windows and Mac OS as well, and you should have a command available to you called node. And once you execute node, you'll see dash version as an argument. You'll see the version show up here. Now I have an older version of node. Okay, so one thing you'll find, especially if you are a professional developer, you might need different versions of Node depending on what's supported on a particular server. Okay, so this is a little bit advanced, but if you're on Linux, Mac OS, or you have WSL installed for Windows 10, WSL stands for Windows Subsystem for Linux. If you have any of those, you can download in, which is a command that basically allows you to manage different node versions. Okay, so in is a command. You go to this website, www.npmjs.com. So npm is a package manager for Node. It allows you to install software onto your system, different packages into your JavaScript projects, but it also allows you to install JavaScript-based commands and stuff like that. So npm is going to be talked about a lot. So with npm we can install in. We scroll down here, how to install. If you install Node, then npm is automatically installed with it. And then you can install globally. The -G option means globally, and we're going to install in. All right, and once you've done that, you can look and see what the commands are for in. All right, so the easiest thing to do would just be type in latest, and that installs the latest node release, downloading it if necessary. Or you could say in LTS, and that installs the latest LTS version. Okay, so I could say in LTS. All right, and in LS, this shows me the different versions that I have installed. Okay, so now when I type node version, we see we're up to date with the latest LTS version. All right, so that's nice. And then for each one of these versions, if you install something from npm globally, it keeps track of what you've installed globally just for each particular node version. Okay, so one of the things in any node version you're going to install is probably ESLint, which stands for ECMAScript lint. A linter basically goes over your code and scans it for errors. All right, so we're going to install a linter with npm. So this is the Node package manager, and we're going to install globally ESLint. Okay, and it's going to get all the dependencies for this package, and then it tells you, how long it took to install it, and now it's installed. So now we have the command ESLint available for us, and there is the help for ESLint. And again, we're going to use this. We're going to tie this into our text editor. So as we type JavaScript, we're going to see live linter activity showing us if we have any errors or anything like that. Now it's not going to catch all the errors, but it is going to catch a whole lot of common mistakes. So you don't have to run your program to test to see if it's working, to test if the code has any errors. So this is a huge time saver. So whatever node version you get, you don't necessarily need to install in, but you do need a node version. And if you install node, you're going to want to install ESLint right here afterwards. Okay, so let's take a look at Node. When I type Node by itself, we enter Node interactive mode. Okay, so we see this little greater than symbol. This is our prompt. When we see this, this lets us know that we are no longer at the command line. We're at the Node interactive mode command line. Okay, so this is not the Linux command line or the Windows command line. This is Node. And here we can type in expressions, anything that we might want to do. Stuff like this. And we get a result. And the expressions are evaluated under normal mathematical rules. We have parentheses. Everything in the parentheses must be executed first. The order of operations, exponentiation happens before addition, and that sort of thing. So standard expressions, and you can execute a line of JavaScript, and then if it's an expression, the result will display below. Okay, not every single line of JavaScript is an expression, so you might not always get a result here. All right, so that is Node, and we can, to exit out, you type dot exit, and that takes us back to the command line. All right, now this is the generally said to be the server-side version of JavaScript. So as we mentioned, JavaScript was originally designed to be in a browser, and for years that was the only option. Node is only a little over a decade old, but JavaScript, as we said, has been around since 1995 or so. So if we look in, we take some website, it doesn't matter what, there are developer tools. If you're a web developer, you need to kind of look at what's going on with your web page. All right, so you can go to, on any web browser has some sort of developer tools, at least any desktop web browser. You can go to Web Developer and then Toggle Tools, Control-Shift-I. And that's sort of, I think the I originally was the inspector, so the inspector is something a little different now, but Control-Shift-I should work on most of the browsers, at least Firefox and Chrome. So this will toggle your tools. Now you can do it manually with the menu, but you'll want to eventually get used to these tools. So Control-Shift-I opens up this nice developer tools menu. Now the inspector, that has to do with the HTML, and we're going to talk about HTML a little bit later, but we're going to just focus on JavaScript right now. But this is HTML, and that's basically the structure of your website. All right, but the JavaScript side of things is the console. So notice we have a console here, and we have the greater than symbols. So here there's two greater than symbols instead, and we're in Firefox right now, and we have the same type of things. Right? We can execute lines of JavaScript, and if it is an expression, it will evaluate and give us the result. Okay, so this is very similar to the terminal style that we have going here with Node. Right? Now this engine, these platforms are a little bit different. The browser, you can imagine the browser has to be secure. Right? So the things that we can do in the browser are somewhat different than the things that we can do in NodeJS. Okay, the browser must be sandboxed, it must be safe, because if you think about it, we're downloading code from the internet from some server that we don't necessarily know, and we're just visiting a web page. So we don't want the browser to have access to our file system, for one thing, right? We don't want anything we download, any website, we don't want them to just willy-nilly have access to our files, because that's very insecure, right? They could steal all our private information, scan our computer, all sorts of stuff. So there's this sort of sandbox, this protective area that JavaScript runs in when it runs in a browser. But it can do things that Node can't necessarily. So some of the things that the browser implementation of JavaScript can do, for example, would be manipulate the web page, manipulate the HTML that goes into your web page, and that's commonly called the DOM, the Document Object Model. So JavaScript can retrieve elements. It could retrieve an element like this and maybe change the color or move it around, and that's the dynamic nature of JavaScript. That's why JavaScript was originally designed in 1995, to make your page interactive and dynamic. Okay, but after a while, people realized it would be nice to have the same language that they used in the browsers on the back end. So whenever you have a language on the front end, or the client, or the web browser, right? The web browser is called the client. It's a web client. It usually sends information to a back end. For example, if you log into a page, you're sending information about that user and their password to verify their identity. That information goes somewhere and it has to interact with the system on the back end, right? So on the back end, there's some computer program running that interacts with the web page. So wouldn't it be nice if we had on that back end the same language that we use in the front end, right? So previous to NodeJS, server-side JavaScript, other programming languages were used on the back end. You might have a Java back end or a C back end or something like that. But nowadays, it's very, very common in web development to just have JavaScript on the front end, on the client, in the browser, right? But then also on the back end have JavaScript. So it's kind of nice using the same language for both. And that was sort of the idea behind Node and why it came about. So Node is commonly called server-side JavaScript. All right. Now the platform for Node is different. As we said, it doesn't have the same restrictions that a browser has. It's specifically designed to be more like a fully featured programming language. So it does have access to your file system. Now the idea with Node is you're never just downloading random code from the internet and running it. So that's why Node can have access to your file system. Node can have access to different things because you only run code with Node that you trust, code that you've actually written yourself, or libraries that you trust and have been tested by lots of people, right? So that is the main distinction between the two sort of platforms, the two engines. You have the server-side NodeJS JavaScript engine, and it does have more access, including access to your file system, but you're not running random code on it. Now the browser, however, has a JavaScript engine. It's a little bit different. It can access HTML elements, the DOM, different things like that, but it cannot access your file system, right? And that's for security reasons, right? So that's the basic idea, the premise of JavaScript, a little bit of the history, and sort of how it works in the two main platforms, the web and then the server side. Okay, so in the upcoming videos, we'll get into a little bit more about the language, the syntax, and how everything works.